Chapter 5. The Hangman's Tree. The road northward shimmered beneath the warm midday sun, a rare moment of peace, as birds chirped overhead and the soft breeze rustled the tall grass. The party walked in good spirits, trading the occasional jest or wary glance at the horizon. As the trail curved through a sparse stretch of woodland, they passed a time-worn wooden sign planted firmly by the road. Its carved letters, though weathered, remained legible. Ashen Hollow, 4 miles, with a crude arrow pointing eastward. No one in the group had heard of such a village before. "Sounds inviting," Bob muttered, adjusting his cloak. "I don't like it," Zal grunted, eyeing the tree line. Still, curiosity, and perhaps a whisper of fate, pulled them onward along the path. Then they saw it. Just along the side of the road, among some twisted trees, one stood apart. Pale as bone, it rose from a mound of earth with outstretched branches, draped in thick, gnarled vines. It looked more sculpture than tree, devoid of leaves, a monument to something ancient and grim. The group slowed and neared to take a closer look. And then, without a sound or warning, the vines snapped to life, whipping and lashing with unnatural speed. Each of them was caught by the throat, a noose tightening with alarming strength. There was a flash, a twisting pull, and then silence. They stood, unbound but shaken, teleported to the head of a long cobbled road. It was night now, dim and overcast, though no stars shone above. All around them, a quiet fog clung low to the ground. The town before them was pristine in its layout, almost unnaturally so. Identical-looking buildings flanked the road, spaced perfectly on either side. Shops, homes, a tavern, all stood still, abandoned and silent. "What just happened?" Alaric whispered. "I think we've been transported," Levi said, eyes narrowing. They began walking down the road, peering through the broken windows and cracked doors of the buildings. The first few held only decay, dusty shelves, rotted furniture, cobwebbed rafters. A general store, a tailor, a tavern with overturned mugs still sitting on empty tables. Then, as they reached the 6th building, Ost froze. "Wait a minute," he said, stepping inside. He picked up a shattered piece of ceramic from the floor and placed it carefully on the windowsill. The group moved on. The 7th building was identical, down to the stains on the wallpaper and the broken leg on the same corner chair. Inside, the ceramic shard was there again, already resting on the windowsill, exactly as he'd left it. They tried another, and another, all the same, perfect repetitions. No matter what they touched or moved, every few houses down, it would repeat. The same buildings, the same layout, the same decay. "This is wrong," Alaric said softly. "This place is looping." At the end of the street stood a solitary mansion. Unlike the houses before it, this structure loomed larger, its peaked roof rising like a crown above the fog. The iron gate creaked open on its own as they approached. The mansion's dark windows watched them like hollow eyes. And somewhere, distant but present, came the soft, creaking sound of rope under tension, like a noose swaying gently in a phantom breeze. The iron gate groaned shut behind them, leaving the adventurers facing the imposing double doors of the mansion. With an uneasy glance between them, Zal placed a hand on the handle and pushed. To their surprise, the interior was pristine. Though sparse in furniture and decoration, the grand foyer gleamed. Clean, polished floors reflected the faint, sourceless light that bathed the space. No dust coated the surfaces, no cobwebs clung to the corners. It was as if the place had been waiting. expectant. Before them stretched a sweeping staircase, its polished banister curving upward into shadow. As they took a cautious step inside, Ost froze. His hand went to his weapon, eyes narrowing. "Up there," he said, voice low. At the top of the stairs, half shrouded in gloom, stood a figure. Tall, still, and cloaked in shadow, it lacked discernible features. But it was watching, and when it realized it had been seen, it turned, not hurriedly, but with eerie calm, and glided down the upper hallway to the left, disappearing from view. "Wait," Alaric called out, but the figure was already gone. Without a second thought, they raced up the stairs, boots thudding against polished wood. The hallway above was lined with evenly spaced doors, each identical in size and craftsmanship, each bearing a brass nameplate. One by one, they read them. Levi, Zal, Alaric, Bob. Each member stood before a door, bearing their own name. No one spoke. The mansion had been empty a moment ago. Now it seemed far too personal. Levi's brow furrowed. "I don't like this." "I don't think it cares what you like," Bob replied, reaching for his handle with a shrug. Zal glanced down the hall, toward the direction the figure had vanished. The air here was colder, thicker somehow, and the silence had weight. "I guess we're expected," he said grimly. One by one, they each took their place in front of their own doors, pulled by some unknown desire to discover what had beckoned them. Levi was instantly drawn into an opulent chamber that stood in stark contrast to the decayed buildings they'd passed outside. Silk sheets draped the bed, thick and inviting, and incense curled lazily through the air, masking the room in a sweet, heady perfume. Lounging atop the bed were two breathtaking women, their eyes smoldering with desire and mystery. "Join us, handsome," one purred, patting the space between them with long, elegant fingers. Levi hesitated only a moment. Well, it would be rude to refuse hospitality, he reasoned aloud, slipping off his cloak and easing on to the edge of the bed. Their hands found him quickly, cool, smooth, enticing. Fingertips traced his arms, his chest, down his back. One hand lingered longer than the rest, nails slowly sharpening, growing almost imperceptibly until a sudden sting bit into his skin. Levi flinched but hesitated, half convinced this was merely part of the experience. Then came a sharp gasp from the other woman, lower and more guttural. That was the moment the illusion cracked. Levi scrambled backward off the bed, breath catching as he hit the floor with a grunt. He reached up and conjured a small, flickering flame in his palm. With a snap, prestidigitation, and the light washed over the room, revealing the truth. Their once beautiful faces had twisted grotesquely. Hollow cheeks, yellowed fangs, eyes like burning coals. Their skin sagged in pallid folds, limbs gnarled and too long. They were no longer women, they were hags. Terrible, ancient, hungry. But they remained on the bed, lounging as if nothing had changed. "Come back, dear," one rasped. "We're still so hungry." The other licked her cracked lips. "Don't be afraid. It only hurts for a little while." Levi gathered his clothes, backing toward the door without taking his eyes off them. He bolted out into the hall, heart pounding, their pleading voices chasing after him as he slammed the door shut. And still, they called through the wood in chorus, low, lilting, hungry. "Come back." Zal entered the room slowly, the heavy wooden door creaking shut behind him. The chamber was dim, its walls bare, save for a mirror that reflected nothing and a solitary lantern casting long shadows. In the center stood Roan, still, silent, and bathed in pale light. "Zal," Rowan said softly, his voice calm and familiar. "How have you been?" Zal froze, throat tightening. "Rowan? How are your new traveling companions?" Rowan asked, stepping slightly closer. "Do they follow your orders, or are they just more people for you to fail?" Zal flinched at the words, unsure how to respond. Rowan tilted his head. "Why did you leave me?" "I didn't," Zal said quickly. "I tried to reach you. I fought to get to you." "But you didn't, did you?" Rowan's voice sharpened, like a blade drawn from its sheath. "You let me die, alone, and you lived." Zal's mouth opened, but no words came. His fingers tightened into fists. "You left me behind," Rowan continued, now advancing. "You survived while I bled out in the dark. Was that Saloon's will, or just your cowardice?" "That's not fair," Zal began, but the words faltered under the weight of shame. Rowan's eyes darkened. "Your weakness cost me my life. You failed your oath. You failed your goddess. You failed me." The air grew colder. Zal's knees nearly buckled under the weight of guilt and grief. "If you have any honor left," Rowan's voice was low and venomous now, "then end your miserable life. Join me in death, and perhaps you'll find forgiveness in the grave." Shaking, Zal reached for his sword. The hilt felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hands. He pressed the tip to his abdomen, breath shallow, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. "Forgive me, Rowan," he whispered. "Forgive me." He paused, on the brink, and then the sword slipped from his hands, clattering loudly to the floor. Zal collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, eyes lifted. "Saloon," he rasped. "Please, forgive me." A radiant glow bloomed from above. Moonlight, warm and silvery, filled the room like a tidal wave of grace. It washed over him, soft and powerful, burning away the guilt, the fear, the lies. The shade of Rowan vanished like mist in the light, and in its place came peace. Zal rose slowly, shoulders square, his gaze clear. "Saloon is with me," he said, voice steady. And he turned toward the door, sword in hand, ready to rejoin the others. Alaric blinked against the sudden shift in lighting as the door closed softly behind him. The atmosphere changed entirely. Warm lantern light bathed a bustling tavern filled with familiar faces and the hum of merriment. Cheers rose from the crowd the moment they saw him. "Alaric!" someone shouted. "Play us a song, Alaric," a woman demanded. "Alaric!" echoed another. Soon, the whole room was chanting his name in rhythmic unison. "Alaric! Alaric! Alaric!" Grinning, shoulders rolling back, Alaric bowed with a flourish. "Well, if the people demand music," he said with a wink. He unslung his lute and took center stage beneath a mounted lantern. The tavern quieted expectantly. He plucked a few warm-up chords, adjusted the tuning, and began to play. The first line of the ballad came out smooth. Then his voice cracked, sharp and high-pitched, like a nervous adolescent. He cleared his throat and powered on, brushing it off with a forced chuckle. But a second misstep followed, this time a sour chord, as his fingers fumbled the frets. The room shifted. Smiles faded. Eyebrows furrowed. Patrons glanced sideways at each other, confused murmurs replacing cheers. "Is that part of the song?" one muttered. Alaric kept going, his eyes darting between strings and the increasingly indifferent faces. A third mistake, another voice crack, drew a sharp inhale from the crowd. A woman near the front folded her arms. "This is painful," "Useless bard," someone whispered. Then louder this time, "Useless bard." Others picked it up. "Useless bard, useless bard." They began to chant, louder and louder, like a wave crashing over him. Alaric's strumming slowed. His voice faltered again. His fingers, once confident, shook as he fumbled to play the next note. The strings buzzed. Wrong key. Off rhythm. A cacophony. "You can't even carry your own story," someone jeered. "The group has to save you." "You're worthless." Laughter, derision, a hailstorm of rejection. Alaric's breath caught. His face pale, he backed toward the door, clutching his lute to his chest like a wounded animal. The crowd continued their chant, some even throwing scraps or mugs as he turned and fled, bursting through the tavern door. Back in the mansion hallway, breath ragged and shame hot in his throat, Alaric steadied himself against the wall. "They weren't real," he muttered. "Just shadows, just ghosts." But the sting of the words lingered far deeper than he cared to admit. Bob stepped into the room, eyes narrowing against the gloom. The light dimmed, flickering strangely, and then he saw them, his companions seated around a long table in the center of the chamber. Zal, Ost, Levi, and Alaric. All turned to look at him with cold, accusing stares. Levi stood first, brows furrowed, voice slow and cutting. "I'm missing some coin," he said aloud to the group. "Odd, isn't it? Where could it have gone?" His eyes locked onto Bob. "Unless someone took it?" Bob scoffed. "Come on, really?" "I've been watching you," Ost added coolly. "Always vanishing when trouble starts. Always last to help. You didn't lift a finger back at the bar the other night." "You started that fight," Alaric said, with a tight frown, "then left us to finish it." "You'd betray us for a gold piece," Levi said quietly. "No," Zal rumbled. "He'd do it for a copper." Bob opened his mouth, but no words came out. The room closed in. The group rose one by one, encircling him like predators. "Thief," Levi said, voice a whisper now, more venomous for it. "Liar," Ost growled. "Betrayer," said Alaric. "You think we don't know who you are," Ost said, his voice almost sympathetic. "You think we're blind?" "You're nothing," Zal finished, towering over Bob now. "You came from nothing. You'll end as nothing. No one will care. No one will remember." Their voices rose, overlapping, distorted by the strange acoustics of the room. Mocking laughter, insults, echoing endlessly. Bob backed up until his heel hit the wall. He clenched his jaw. "None of this is real," he muttered to himself. "Just shadows, tricks. They don't know me. They don't know anything," he said to himself as he fumbled for the doorknob behind him. But even he wasn't sure he believed it. The hallway where they reunited felt colder than before. Each of them stood changed, haunted by their own encounter behind the personalized doors. No one spoke at first, but the silence hung heavy with unspoken weight. Then a sudden crack of thunder boomed from the far end of the hall, and all eyes turned toward a tall, dust-smeared window set into the wall. Lightning arced across the sky outside, followed by the rhythmic tapping of hard rain against the glass. Drawn by some shared instinct, the group approached the window. There, in the distance beyond the grounds, a castle loomed. Its spires clawed toward the clouds, shrouded in shadows and mist. Between the mansion and the castle, a sloping cemetery stretched out, row upon row of crooked gravestones, and atop each one, a figure stood. They were human-shaped, cloaked in black, motionless, hundreds of them facing the mansion in perfect formation. At first, it was too dark to make out any features until another flash of lightning lit the graveyard in stark brilliance. Their faces were revealed. Grotesque, twisted smiles stretched impossibly wide. Rows of jagged, unnatural teeth gleamed beneath their hoods. Empty, gleaming eyes peered up at the window where the group stood. Every figure stared at them with hungry anticipation, unmoving but brimming with dreadful intent. "Enough of this," Zal growled, his voice low and full of mounting fury. Without waiting, he turned and thundered down the stairs, his boots pounding against the wood. The others followed quickly behind. They threw open the mansion doors. Gone was the repeating town street. The front steps now overlooked the graveyard they had seen from the window, the black-cloaked figures nowhere in sight. Rain poured in heavy sheets, soaking their armor and cloaks within moments. Zal didn't hesitate. He stomped into the cemetery, each grave marker bearing a familiar name. Aust caught up and slowed beside him, glancing at the headstones. Zal's jaw tightened as he knelt before one of them. "Mailer," he muttered. "Sergeant from Halazone." Another step. "Krask, I pulled you from the fire lines." Another. Each grave bore the name of a fallen brother in arms. Dozens, hundreds, all comrades, all dead. Still finding nothing of substance, Zal moved forward. Then came another flash of lightning, and in the split-second illumination, the castle revealed itself once more. Closer now, just beyond the last row of graves. On its battlements, hooded figures conducted a sinister ritual. Energies gathering ominously. "We've got to stop them," Aust called urgently. The group approached the looming castle at its edge. A rusted portcullis groaned shut behind them as they stepped through, locking them in. Exterior steps wound up the side of the keep in a tight switchback. The rain intensified. Thunder cracked overhead, and with each flash of lightning, figures appeared just feet ahead, hooded shapes, grinning from ear to ear, with mouths too wide and teeth too many. When the lightning faded, they vanished. There, only in the light, always watching. Zal pressed forward, undeterred. The steps ended atop the castle roof, a broad stone expanse slick with rain. At its center, 8 hooded conjurers stood in a perfect circle around a dark void. Arms outstretched, they chanted in unison, calling forth something from beyond. The portal writhed, pulsing black like a wound in the world. Then it emerged. A tree, no, a monster. Gnarled roots twisted into limbs, black as pitch and dripping with decay. A blackroot trent. It rose, towering above them, bark splitting in unnatural seams. Without hesitation, the conjurers laughed with glee and flung themselves into the creature's maw, their screams lost in grotesque crunches. The treant turned, and it began to walk toward them. The group whirled to flee, only to find solid stone behind them where the stairs had been. The way down was gone, trapped. Aust acted first, loosing a volley of arrows as he darted left. The treant swept an enormous limb in a wide arc, slamming Aust with such force that he sailed off the rooftop, vanishing over the edge. "No!" Zal roared. Levi conjured a fireball, launching it skyward. The explosion bathed the treant in searing light, then flickered and died as rain swallowed the flames. Bob used the distraction to climb the treant's bark, stabbing in vain at exposed knots. The creature twisted its body in an unnatural spasm, snatched Bob in a branch-like hand, and held him high as lightning flashed behind him. Then it fed. Bob was gone. Alaric, cornered, raised his blade with shaking hands. Zal lunged in desperation, hacking at the tree's back leg. The blade struck, but it was like cutting stone. Splinters flew, but the treant didn't falter. Thick vines lashed forward and coiled around Alaric's neck. One violent jerk lifted him from the ground. His neck snapped with a sickening pop. Still twitching, Alaric was lowered into the moor. Levi unleashed silver bolts from across the roof, aiming for the gaping mouth. They struck true, but vanished into darkness as if never cast. One long, grotesque limb shot out, snatched Levi from where he stood, and folded inward, wrapping around him like a second skin. Then he, too, was gone. Only Zal remained, bloodied, alone. He dropped to his knees in the pouring rain, desperate, clutching his sword, whispering, "Saloon, please." The treant loomed above him, its gnarled face splitting open once more. But this time, there was no void. A pinpoint of white light formed within the darkness. It grew, brighter and brighter, until the light engulfed everything. Zal lifted his hand against it, squinting. And suddenly, he was staring at the midday sun through his fingers. Ost was beside him, hacking frantically at thick vines wrapped around his neck. The rest of the group choked and gasped, pulling nooses from their throats. They were back, on the road. Alaric sat up groaning. Anyone else feel like they were swallowed by a tree? Bob checked his limbs, then his belt pouch. Still got everything that matters. Levi spat dirt and rubbed his throat. Next time, we burn the creepy tree. Zal stared forward, unmoving, then slowly stood. Saloon has shown me our path more clearly than ever. Fantastic, Alaric muttered, brushing moss from his boots. Mind drawing the rest of us a map? The group looked around, dazed, as the realization set in. Each of them bore fresh bruises on their necks, red lines where the vines had coiled. Alaric furrowed his brow. Wait, how did you get out, Ost? Ost blinked. Out of what? The vines, Zal said, his voice low. Wrapped around our necks. We were caught, enchanted, limp. Ost raised an eyebrow. I just saw you all drop like stones. It tried to get me too, but I'm an elf. Enchantments like that don't work on me. He gestured toward the tree behind them, where withered vines still twitched on the bark. Took me a couple of seconds to cut you free. You all went limp, entranced or something. Creepy magic. Levi muttered, You cut us down from the Hangman's tree. Yeah, Ost replied, sheathing his blade. You're welcome. Bob stood slowly, brushing his hands together. So, is anyone else suddenly in the mood for dry, flat roads and zero cursed vegetation? No one argued. They traveled on from the tree, making their way further on the road until they came upon a strange, deserted town. Its crooked road lined on either side with identical shops and houses, eerily familiar. The same mismatched shutters, the same cracked windows, the same worn signs. It was the village from their shared vision. Ost narrowed his eyes. Hey, should we check these out? No, came the emphatic, unified shout from the rest of the group, their collective eyes never leaving the path ahead.